The scent of time was a perfume Elara Vance knew intimately. It was the dry, sweet fragrance of decaying paper, the sharp tang of leather preservative, and the earthy undertone of binding glue simmering gently on a hot plate. In her small workshop, tucked away in the forgotten west wing of the Vance Manor, sunlight struggled through a grimy window pane, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing over the spine of a 17th-century folio. Her slender fingers, stained with ink and pigment, moved with a surgeon's precision, tracing the frayed edge of a gold leaf illustration. At 22, Elara was a restorer of rare books, a profession that felt less like a choice and more like a destiny. She breathed life back into things that were fading, all while her own life felt suspended in amber, beautiful but motionless, preserved in a state of perpetual waiting. If you want to know what she is waiting for, and if it will shatter her world, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Her existence was a study in quietude. Elara moved through the cavernous, echoing halls of her family home with a ghost's lightness, her presence barely disturbing the settled dust of generations. Her days were measured not by hours, but by the slow, methodical process of mending torn pages and reinforcing weakened bindings. This meticulous care was a reflection of her own nature, a soul carefully guarded, a heart stitched together with the threads of duty and filial piety. The world outside the crumbling stone walls and overgrown gardens was a distant rumor, a place of noise and chaos she observed from afar but never dared to enter. Her dreams, once as vibrant as the illuminated manuscripts she adored, had long since been packed away, stored in the attic of her mind alongside other youthful fantasies she could no longer afford to entertain. Her purpose was not to live, but to preserve. At the core of her being was a profound and unspoken stillness. Elara was a virgin, not from a fervent commitment to religious or moral ideals, but as a simple, unadorned consequence of a life lived in the service of others. Her youth had been consumed by the long, slow decline of her mother's health, a vigil of bedside stories and hushed comforts that left no room for teenage fumbling or whispered confessions. Now, with her mother gone, that duty had seamlessly transferred to her emotionally fragile younger sister and her desperate, cornered father. Her body was a quiet, unlit room, a secret garden no one had ever been invited to enter, not because the gate was locked, but because no one had ever thought to knock. It was a symbol of her arrested development, the last untouched part of her in a life that had been claimed, piece by piece, by the needs of her family. The Vance Manor itself was a grand, decaying testament to a forgotten era of splendor. It stood on a hill overlooking the misty countryside, its stone facade stained with age, and its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, the air was thick, with the memories of a glory that had long since faded into financial ruin. Sunlight would slice through the gloom of the grand ballroom, illuminating the ghostly outlines on the floor where heavy furniture once stood, and revealing the faded silk of the peeling wallpaper. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a window frame in the wind, was a reminder of their slow, inexorable descent. For Elara, the house was not a home, but a beautiful, ornate cage. It was her legacy and her prison, its crumbling walls a perfect metaphor for the state of her own heart, once proud and full of promise, now struggling to simply hold itself together. The weight of responsibility was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she could never take off. It was in the hollows beneath her sister, Lily's, eyes, a permanent shadow of the grief that threatened to consume her. It was in the frantic, desperate energy of her father, a man chasing ghosts of financial salvation in his dusty, paper-strewn study. Elara was the fulcrum upon which their fragile world balanced. She managed the dwindling household accounts, ensured Lily took her medication, and absorbed her father's silent, overwhelming despair without complaint. She was the steady, quiet center of their storm, the keeper of their secrets and their shame. This role had been assigned to her so long ago that she no longer remembered what it felt like to be simply Elara, a young woman with her own desires, her own fears, and her own future to consider. She was a daughter and a sister. The woman had yet to be born. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the afternoon, a moment of rebellion would flicker within her. While restoring a copy of an old romantic novel, her fingers would trace over a passage describing a first kiss, a stolen dance, a declaration of passionate, all-consuming love. In those moments, the carefully constructed walls around her heart would tremble. A sharp, painful longing would pierce through her resignation, a visceral ache for a life she had only ever read about. The heroines of her books were brave, reckless, and free. They sailed to distant lands, defied convention, and loved with a ferocity that terrified and enthralled her. She would look up from the gilded pages, her gaze falling on the familiar, dusty landscape of her workshop, and the contrast would be a silent, suffocating scream. These stories were the only journeys she was allowed to take. The spell would inevitably break. The distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, or the sound of her father's heavy, defeated footsteps pacing in the room below, would pull her back to reality with a jarring thud. She would carefully close the book, the world of passion and adventure sealed away once more between its leather covers. Her own story remained unwritten, its pages blank and waiting. Rising from her stool, she would smooth down her simple dress and prepare to descend back into the quiet drama of her family's decline. As she stood in the doorway, the fading light cast her long shadow across the floor of the library, making her look like just another relic among the shelves. Perfectly preserved, exquisitely untouched, and utterly, profoundly alone, waiting for a chapter she had no power to write herself. The small town of Oakhaven lay nestled in the valley below the manor, a place of neat little houses with smoking chimneys and a singular church spire that pierced the perpetually gray sky. Elara viewed it from her window as one might view a diorama, a perfect, self-contained world operating on rules she no longer understood. The Vances were a local legend, the family on the hill whose name was etched onto the library and the town hall, but whose present circumstances were a subject of hushed, pitying gossip in the general store. They were ghosts of a bygone era, their decaying home a stark monument to their fall from grace. This social distance was a chasm Elara felt with every rationed bag of flour, every mended dress. She was of this place, but not in it, an outsider in her own ancestral lands, defined only by what her family used to be. Her days were a rosary of quiet obligations, each bead a task that wore her spirit a little thinner. Dawn broke not with promise, but with the need to check on Lily, whose nightmares often left her trembling and pale. Then came the kitchen, a cold, cavernous room where she would stretch their meager supplies into meals that were nourishing but joyless. The mail was a daily torment, a fresh delivery of final notices and letters from solicitors, which she would dutifully collect and place on her father's desk, another silent offering to his consuming despair. Her work in the library was her only respite, a few precious hours where the only demands were those of brittle paper and faded ink. This relentless cycle of caretaking was her reality, a treadmill from which there was no escape, each day a perfect, suffocating replica of the one before. The oppressive weight of her family's legacy was personified by the grand, oil-painted portrait of her mother that dominated the main staircase. Her mother, serene and beautiful in emerald silk, represented a standard of grace and social duty Elara felt she could never achieve. She had been the heart of their world, a woman who navigated society with effortless charm and who believed a woman's purpose was to be the silent, elegant pillar of her family's name. Her father often spoke of this ideal, his voice thick with nostalgia and unspoken accusation. "Your mother knew what sacrifice meant," he would say, his gaze drifting to the portrait. It was a constant, crushing reminder that Elara was failing not only the living but the dead as well, unable to uphold the very traditions that were now strangling them all. Her father's study was the epicenter of the family's desperation, a room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and fear. He had become a wraith, haunting the leather-bound books he could no longer afford, surrounded by towers of unpaid bills and threatening letters. Elara would enter the room with a tray of tea, her footsteps silenced by the thick Persian rug. He rarely acknowledged her, his eyes fixed on ledgers filled with red ink. His silence was more terrifying than any rage. It was the sound of a man drowning, pulling his entire family down with him. She felt his panic as a low hum beneath the floorboards, a constant vibration of impending doom. He was a man cornered by his own pride and poor decisions, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would do anything to find a way out. The bond with her sister Lily was both a source of deep love and a finely wrought chain. Lily, younger by 2 years, had never fully recovered from their mother's death, retreating into a fragile world of anxieties and imagined illnesses. She was a delicate porcelain doll, and Ilara was her constant, vigilant keeper. An unexpected noise, a change in routine, or a perceived slight could send Lily into a spiral of panic that only Ilara could soothe. She would spend hours reading aloud to her in the dim light of Lily's bedroom, her own life put on hold to calm the storms in her sister's mind. This profound sense of responsibility was absolute. The thought of abandoning Lily to the world or to their father's neglect was unthinkable. It was a cage built of love, but its bars were no less real, no less confining. A weekly trip to the village for supplies was a gauntlet of veiled scrutiny. In the dim, cluttered aisles of the grocer's, Ilara could feel the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the owner, tracking her meager purchases. The pity was the worst part. The extra loaf of bread slipped into her bag with a knowing nod. The whispered questions about her father's business. The townspeople remembered the Vances hosting lavish garden parties. Now they saw a pale, somber girl counting out coins for potatoes and milk. They saw a tragedy, a story to be whispered over tea. Their kindness felt like a brand, marking her with the shame of her family's failure. It made her retreat further into the shadows of the manor, preferring the company of silent books to the suffocating sympathy of a world that saw her only as a relic of a fallen house. One rainy afternoon, while searching for linens in a cedar chest, her fingers brushed against a box containing her mother's debutante gown. It was a whisper of ivory silk and seed pearls, preserved in tissue paper like a holy relic. Pulling it out, she held it against her own thin frame, staring at her reflection in a tarnished mirror. The dress was from another life, a life of promise, of dances and suitors and choices. It was a future that had been promised to her too, before everything had crumbled. That path, the one her mother had so carefully laid out, had vanished, overgrown with debt and grief. The gown felt like a costume for a play she would never perform. It was a bitter, tangible symbol of the life she was being groomed for but would never have, a cruel memento of her own unlived youth. The pressure from her father began to solidify, shifting from a general miasma of despair to pointed, calculated remarks. Over their sparse dinners he would speak of legacy, of the duty one has to preserve a family name at any cost. A good name is the only true inheritance, Ilara, he declared one evening, his gaze intense and unnerving. Sometimes, a strategic alliance is the only thing that can save it. It is how great families have always survived. He spoke in abstracts, of alliances and salvation, but his eyes were fixed on her. She felt like a chess piece being positioned on a board, a strategic asset whose purpose was slowly being revealed. The conversations were a form of grooming, preparing her for a sacrifice she did not yet understand but was beginning to dread with every fiber of her being. The manor's gardens, once her mother's pride, had become a wild, untamable thing, a perfect mirror of their lives. Ilara would often walk there, finding a strange comfort in the chaos. One afternoon, while trying to free a climbing rose from a thicket of thorns, a particularly sharp branch snagged the sleeve of her dress, holding her fast. For a moment she struggled, a wave of panic rising in her chest. She was literally ensnared by the decay of her own home. Looking back at the great gray stone house with its dark windows and crumbling facade, she saw it clearly for the first time. It was not a sanctuary but a mausoleum, a beautiful ornate trap that had been waiting for her since the day she was born, and its thorns were now so deeply embedded in her life that she feared she would never break free. The sound was what she noticed first, a low, powerful hum that was utterly alien to the countryside's quiet symphony of wind and birdsong. From the dust-streaked window of her workshop, Ilara watched as a car, long and black and gleaming like polished obsidian, made its way up the winding, weed-choked drive. It moved with a predator's deliberate grace, a stark slash of modernity against the crumbling romance of her world. No one ever visited the manor anymore. As the vehicle came to a stop before the great oak doors, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled deep within her. She didn't know who was inside, but she felt a profound and terrifying certainty that this was not a social call. This was a reckoning. The solution her father had been so desperately seeking had just arrived. The man who emerged from the car was not a man, he was a statement. Dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light, he moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step precise and deliberate on the gravel. Ilara watched from her high window as he paused, his gaze sweeping over the manor's crumbling facade. He wasn't admiring its faded grandeur. He was assessing it, his posture radiating a cold, predatory stillness. His name was Julian Thorne, a name she had only ever seen in the financial pages her father obsessed over, always accompanied by words like ruthless and uncompromising. He was an architect of the modern world, a builder of empires on the bones of older, weaker ones, and his presence here felt like a final, damning judgment on the House of Vance and everything it represented. A voice from below, thin and strained, shattered the quiet. "Elara, come down, please." It was her father, but his tone was one she had never heard before, a brittle, forced cheerfulness that did nothing to mask the raw panic beneath. She placed the delicate bookbinder's needle on her workbench and stood, her own heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Descending the grand staircase, her hand instinctively sought the familiar, worn smoothness of the oak banister, a small anchor in a suddenly churning sea. The air in the foyer was thick with a new kind of tension, an invasive energy that seemed to warp the very light slanting through the high, arched windows. She felt as if she were walking not toward the drawing room, but toward an execution, the silent, painted eyes of her ancestors following her every step. He was standing with his back to the door, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, his attention fixed on the tarnished silver clock that had not ticked in a decade. He was taller than she had imagined, his frame lean but powerful beneath the impeccable tailoring of his suit. "Mr. Thorne," her father stammered, his voice cracking. "This is my eldest daughter, Elara." Julian Thorne turned, not with a start, but with a slow, controlled pivot, and the full force of his presence hit her. His face was a collection of sharp angles and stark planes, handsome in a severe, unforgiving way, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth, and they moved over her with a dispassionate, analytical scrutiny that made her feel less like a person and more like an object being appraised for its worth. The silence that followed was a physical entity, pressing in on her from all sides. Her father, desperate to fill the void, launched into a rambling history of the manor, his words tumbling over one another in a pathetic, nervous cascade. Julian did not seem to hear him. His focus remained entirely on Elara, his stillness a stark and damning contrast to her father's frantic energy. He did not smile or offer a polite greeting. He simply watched, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were peeling back the layers of her quiet existence, searching for the core of her, for the part of her that was most valuable, most vulnerable, most breakable. In his penetrating silence, she heard the loud, unspoken truth of the moment. She was the reason he was here. She was the final, desperate commodity her family had left to sell. She knew the stories that clung to his name like a shroud. They called him the Vulture, a man who circled failing dynasties and picked their bones clean, transforming their legacy into his profit. The premise of his life, according to the whispers of the world, was that everything and everyone had a price tag. Love was a liability, trust a fatal flaw. He had supposedly been forged in a crucible of betrayal years ago, a devastating blow that had burned away whatever softness he might have once possessed, leaving behind only a cold, calculating machine of acquisition and control. Seeing him now, standing in the decaying heart of her home, she believed it. He was the personification of a world she had only read about, a world of brutal transactions and soulless power, and it was clear he had come to collect. "Your father says you mend broken things." His voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant baritone that cut through the room's tension like a blade. It was devoid of inflection, a simple statement of fact directed solely at her. The question was a subtle assertion of power, reducing her life's passion to a quaint, domestic function. She felt a flicker of defiance rise through her fear. "I restore them," she corrected, her own voice barely more than a whisper, yet she forced it to remain steady. "There's a difference. Mending is a temporary fix. Restoration is about returning something to its original truth, its intended state." His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something, interest, perhaps, or surprise, in their cold depths. For the first time, he seemed to see not just an asset, but a person. He moved away from the fireplace, his steps silent on the threadbare Aubusson carpet, and walked toward the towering, built-in bookshelves that lined one wall. His long, elegant fingers ghosted over the spines, not with the reverence of a reader, but with the casual appraisal of a connoisseur. He didn't select one of the rare, leather-bound first editions, but instead pulled out a simple, cloth-covered copy of Wuthering Heights. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. "A story of obsession," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "About a love so powerful it becomes a destructive force, consuming everything in its path." The observation was unnervingly astute, a glimpse into a mind that saw the darkness coiled at the heart of even the most romantic tales. A darkness he seemed to know intimately. He did not put the book back. He turned, holding it loosely in one hand, and his gaze locked with hers once more across the room. In that moment, the drawing room, her father, the entire weight of her family's history, all of it dissolved, leaving only the charged space between them. The unspoken purpose of his visit hung in the air, a palpable, suffocating truth. He was not here to save her father's business. He was not here to buy the manor. He was here to acquire something far more personal, something he viewed as the ultimate symbol of a legacy he could own, a pure bride from a fallen house. The realization was not a thought, but a visceral shock, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones, telling her that her life was no longer her own. As he walked back towards the center of the room, to place the book on a small side table, his path brought him closer to her than he had been before. As he set the novel down, the back of his hand brushed against her forearm, which rested on the table's edge. The contact was electric, a brief, searing touch that was over in an instant but seemed to burn itself into her skin. His flesh was cool, almost cold, yet the jolt it sent through her was anything but. She flinched, pulling her arm back as if stung. His eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, the mask of cold control slipped. She saw a flicker of something primal, a possessive glint that was far more terrifying than his indifference. It was the look of a man who had found what he came for. Without another word to her, he gave a curt, dismissive nod to her father, the transaction seemingly concluded in his mind. "I will be in touch," he stated, the words carrying the weight of an imperial decree. Then he was gone, his departure as swift and silent as his arrival. The low hum of his car faded down the drive, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. The manor, her sanctuary, felt irrevocably tainted, invaded by a force it could not repel. Ilara stood frozen in the center of the room, the ghost of his touch a brand on her arm. The long, quiet chapter of her waiting had just ended, and she knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, that the story now being written would not be a romance, but a surrender. The official announcement came not as a question, but as a verdict. Her father, his face a mask of feigned relief and deep, abiding shame, explained it over a cold dinner of bread and cheese. It was a strategic merger that would save them from utter ruin. He did not use the word marriage, nor did he use the word love. He spoke of contracts and legacies, of Julian Thorne's magnanimous offer to absorb their debts and restore the Vance name. Ilara listened, her hands perfectly still in her lap, feeling the floor drop away beneath her. The dusty, familiar walls of her home were no longer a cage of neglect, but the foundations of a new, gilded prison, and the architect of her captivity was a man with eyes like a winter storm. She was not being asked. She was being informed of the terms of her sale. Their first formal meeting as a betrothed couple was a suffocating exercise in polite fiction. Julian came for dinner, bringing with him an air of cold corporate efficiency that was anathema to the manor's romantic decay. He sat opposite her at the long, scarred dining table, a chasm of polished wood between them. Her father chattered nervously, filling the silence with pointless anecdotes, while Lily watched them both with wide, frightened eyes. Ilara said nothing. She moved the food around her plate, the taste of it turning to ash in her mouth. She could feel Julian's gaze on her, not with warmth or even curiosity, but with the cool, possessive assessment of a man examining a recent, and very expensive, acquisition. He was a collector, and she was to be his rarest, most untouched piece. He began visiting the manor with a disquieting regularity, under the pretense of discussing the estate's restoration with her father. But his feet always, inevitably led him to the west wing, to the quiet, sun-dusted sanctuary of her workshop. He would stand in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the light, and simply watch her work. He never interrupted, never offered a word of praise or criticism. His silent presence was an invasion, a powerful magnetic force that disrupted the delicate peace of her world. The air would grow thick and heavy, charged with all the things they never said. She would feel the fine hairs on her arms stand on end, her fingers suddenly clumsy on the fragile pages. Her sanctuary was no longer safe. It had become the primary stage for their silent war of wills. One afternoon, as she was carefully mixing a pigment to match the faded lapis lazuli of a medieval manuscript, he finally spoke. "What is the binding agent?" The question was abrupt, technical, devoid of pleasantry. Startled, she looked up, meeting his intense, analytical gaze. For a moment, she was tempted to remain silent, to deny him even this small piece of her world. But the question was about her craft, the one part of her life where she felt a sense of mastery and purpose. A flicker of pride cut through her fear. "Gum arabic and honey," she replied, her voice clearer than she expected. "It creates a viscosity that allows the pigment to adhere to the vellum without cracking as it dries." She saw a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes, a grudging respect for her knowledge that was entirely separate from their transaction. That small exchange broke a seal between them. He began to ask more questions, his inquiries always precise, intelligent, and focused on the mechanics of her art. He was a man who understood systems, and he seemed fascinated by the intricate ancient system she commanded. She, in turn, found herself explaining the delicate chemistry of restoration, the patient art of mending a world torn apart by time. In those moments, he was not Julian Thorne, the predator who had bought her future. And she was not Elara Vance, the sacrificial lamb. They were simply two minds engaging, a brief and dangerous armistice in their unspoken conflict. She started to see the sharp, logical intellect behind his cold facade, and she hated herself for finding it compelling, for the tiny, treacherous part of her that looked forward to his intrusions. The tension between them began to shift, evolving from a simple dynamic of captor and captive into something far more complex and dangerous. One day he stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder to examine the intricate gold leaf she was applying with a feather-light touch. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the subtle, clean scent of expensive wool and something uniquely his, a faint trace of cedar and cold night air. His proximity was an overwhelming physical reality, an invasion of her personal space that was both terrifying and, to her profound shame, electrifying. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She was acutely aware of every inch of him, of the power held in check in his lean frame, and a strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed low in her belly. Her nights became a torment of conflicting emotions. In the darkness of her room, she would replay their interactions, her mind obsessing over the timbre of his voice, the intensity of his gaze, the ghost of his presence at her shoulder. She despised him. He was the architect of her doom, the man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. Yet her body betrayed her with a will of its own, responding to his nearness with a deep, primal tremor she had never experienced. The heroines in her books felt a love that was a grand, sweeping passion. This feeling was different. It was dark, sharp, and laced with fear, a terrifying curiosity about the man who was her jailer. The guilt was a constant, bitter companion, whispering that she was becoming complicit in her own destruction. Julian, too, was caught in an undertow of his own making. He had approached this arrangement with the same detached strategy he applied to a corporate takeover. Elara was to be a symbol of his victory, a beautiful, pure fixture in his new life, a final rebuke to the woman who had betrayed him. He had not anticipated her quiet defiance, her fierce intelligence, or the way the sunlight caught in her hair as she bent over her work. He found himself manufacturing reasons to visit the manor, drawn to the silent intensity of her workshop. This girl, who should have been a simple passive acquisition, was becoming a complication, an unwelcome fissure in the cold, orderly fortress of his world. He had come to possess her, but he was beginning to fear she might, in some inexplicable way, possess him instead. The breaking point came on a storm-lashed evening. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, Ilara slipped into her father's forbidden study. There, lying starkly on the mahogany desk amidst a sea of unpaid bills, was the contract. She picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the cold, legalistic prose. It was worse than she had imagined. The document was a masterpiece of dehumanization, referring to her not by name, but as the asset, her hand in marriage a clause in the transfer of familial obligations. The words burned themselves into her mind, searing away any lingering shred of hope that this was anything other than a cold, hard purchase of her life, her body, and her future. The quiet resignation she had been clinging to shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, crystalline rage. He was in the library when she found him, standing before a dying fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. She didn't hesitate. She strode into the room, the contract clutched in her fist, and threw it onto the table between them. It landed with a soft, damning slap. "I read it," she said, her voice low and shaking with a fury that surprised them both. He turned slowly, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. She met his gaze without flinching, her fear eclipsed by the need to reclaim some small piece of herself. "I have to know," she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "When you look at me, when you stand in my home and plan to take over my life, what exactly do you see that you have bought?" His expression did not soften. There was no apology, no flicker of remorse in the stormy depths of his eyes. He took a slow sip from his glass before answering, his voice a low, chillingly calm counterpoint to her fire. "I don't see a girl, Ilara. I see a solution," he stated, the words precise and brutal. "I see a legacy that my name, my money, can resurrect from the dead. I see the end of a long and tiresome war I've been fighting since I was your age. I see order." He didn't try to romanticize it or soften the blow. He laid the truth of his motives bare, a cold, hard stone dropped into the roiling waters of her anger. He saw her as a strategic move, the final, perfect piece to complete the impenetrable fortress he had built around his life. The brutal honesty of his confession, intended perhaps to crush her, had an entirely unexpected effect. The rage inside her did not extinguish, it clarified. The polite fictions and veiled threats were gone, and in their place was a stark, unvarnished reality. She was not a bride-to-be, she was a combatant in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. Paradoxically, this terrible clarity was empowering. She finally understood the rules of the game. She was no longer just a passive victim of her father's desperation, but an unwilling player opposite a man who had shown her his entire strategy. A strange, cold calm settled over her. If she was to be a piece in his game, she would not be a pawn. She would learn to play. A few days later he found her in the wild, overgrown gardens, wrestling with the same thorny rosebush that had once snagged her dress. A branch had caught on her sleeve again, and she was struggling to free herself without tearing the fabric. He approached without a word, his expensive leather shoes silent on the damp earth. Before she could protest, he was beside her, his large, surprisingly gentle hands moving to the branch. With a surgeon's precision, he worked the thorns free, his fingers brushing against her arm in the process. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a shiver through her entire body. He freed her without a single tear in the cloth. For a moment they stood in silence, surrounded by the beautiful, untamed chaos of the garden. His simple, practical act, a profound contradiction to his cold, calculating words. "My mother loved these roses," she said softly, breaking the silence. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. She tried to tame them, to prune them into perfect shapes. They always grew back wilder. Julian looked from the tangled bush to her, his gaze lingering. "Some things aren't meant to be tamed," he said, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "Their strength is in their wildness. You try to control them, and you only destroy what made them beautiful in the first place." The words hung in the air between them, a perfect, unintentional metaphor for their own situation. He was speaking of the roses, but they both knew he was also in some way speaking of her. It was the first time he had acknowledged her spirit, her essence as something more than a feature to be acquired. This was the core of her new, terrifying dilemma. It was one thing to be sacrificed to a monster, a cold, unfeeling villain. She could have built walls of hatred around her heart and endured. But this man was not a simple monster. He was a complex tapestry of contradictions, ruthless ambition and surprising gentleness, brutal honesty and moments of profound, unexpected insight. She was beginning to see the wounded man beneath the predator, the lonely king in his cold, empty castle. To feel pity for him was dangerous. To feel a flicker of understanding was fatal. The battle was no longer a simple choice between her duty and her freedom. It was now a war being fought within her own heart, between the girl who was terrified of him and the woman who was inexplicably, dangerously drawn to him. He began to bring her gifts. They were never flowers or jewelry, the traditional tokens of courtship. Instead, they were things only she would understand. A set of antique bone folders from a Florentine artisan. A small sealed jar of rare cochineal pigment sourced from a remote Peruvian village. A first edition of a treatise on paper preservation. They were not gifts of seduction, but of recognition. Each one was a silent acknowledgement of her world, her skill, her passion. It was his language, the only one he knew how to speak fluently, the language of value, of acquisition. But he was not just acquiring her. He was investing in her, seeing and supplying the very things that made her who she was. It was a subtle, insidious form of courtship that bypassed all her defenses and struck directly at her soul. Ilara accepted each gift with a confusing mix of emotions that left her feeling hollow and breathless. Gratitude warred with a deep sense of shame. Each beautiful, thoughtful object felt like another bar on her cage, making it more ornate, more comfortable, and infinitely harder to resent. He was not trying to change her or erase her, but to understand and even nurture the very essence of her being. This was a form of possession far more complete than any legal contract. He was slowly, methodically making himself essential to her world. She was being seduced not by romance, but by the intoxicating, terrifying feeling of being truly seen. The wedding date was now a firm, unmovable point on the horizon, and as it drew closer, Ilara stood in her workshop, surrounded by his offerings, caught between the terrifying surrender of her body and the even more terrifying surrender of her heart. The eve of the wedding arrived not with celebratory bells, but with the suffocating silence of a tomb. Sleep was an impossible shore Ilara could not reach, her mind a storm-tossed sea of dread and a strange, treacherous anticipation. The white gown hanging on her wardrobe door looked like a ghost, the specter of a future she had not chosen. In that deep, silent hour before dawn, a rebellion took root in her heart. It was not a rebellion of escape, but of confrontation. She would not go to the altar as a passive, frightened lamb. She needed to face her captor one last time, not as an asset, but as a woman. Slipping out of her room, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, she was drawn not to the exit, but to the one place in the manor that felt as haunted as she did. The abandoned grand ballroom. He was there as if summoned by the sheer force of her turmoil. Julian stood in the center of the vast, empty room. A solitary figure bathed in the stark, silver light of the moon pouring through the towering, arched windows. Dust motes danced in the ethereal beams, illuminating the ghostly outlines on the floor where opulent furniture once stood and couples had once waltzed. The air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories, a melancholic perfume of faded grandeur. He held a glass of whiskey, but he wasn't drinking, merely staring into the cavernous darkness, as if searching for something lost. He seemed less like a conquering victor on the eve of his triumph, and more like a king surveying the ruins of his own desolate, lonely kingdom. His presence in this place of ghosts felt profoundly, achingly appropriate. She moved into the room, her light dressing gown whispering against the dusty floor. The sound was infinitesimal, yet in the profound silence it was like a shout. He turned, his body moving with that familiar, controlled grace. But she saw the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He was not surprised to see her. His expression was one of grim inevitability, as if he had been waiting for this final, desperate move in their silent game. He didn't speak, simply watched her approach, his stormy eyes tracking her every step as she crossed the moon-drenched floor. The space between them crackled with an unbearable tension, a mixture of fear, defiance, and a dark, magnetic pull that had grown too powerful for either of them to deny any longer. This was their true altar, this ruin of a room. "Tomorrow, you will own everything," she began, her voice a low, trembling thread in the vast emptiness, yet it carried the weight of her entire being. "This house, my father's name, my future." She stopped a few feet from him, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "But I have to know, before it's done, what is it you truly want? When you have stripped away the contracts and the debts, when I am standing before you with nothing left to give, what will you take from me then? What is it you are really buying, Julian?" The question was not an accusation, but a raw, vulnerable plea for a single, unvarnished truth in a world that had become a fortress of lies. She was offering him her final, most guarded possession, her genuine, terrified curiosity about the man behind the monster. For a long moment he said nothing, the silence stretching until it was thin and sharp enough to cut. Then a muscle in his jaw clenched. "I am buying silence," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its usual cold precision. "The silence of the men who called my father a failure. The silence of the partners who betrayed me." He took a step closer, his gaze burning into hers. "I'm buying a history I can control, a legacy that can't be stolen. When the woman I loved sold my secrets and my future for a better offer, she taught me that love is just the word people use for the thing they want most. She hollowed me out, Ilara. And I have spent a decade filling that emptiness with things that are solid, tangible, things that can't lie or leave." His confession was not a plea for sympathy. It was a statement of fact, a glimpse into the barren landscape of his soul. In that moment, the predator vanished, and she saw only the wounded man, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, a prison of bitterness and distrust far more absolute than her own. A wave of a new, terrifying emotion washed over her. Not pity, but a profound, aching empathy. He was not a monster. He was a ruin, just like her home, a magnificent structure that had been gutted by a terrible fire, leaving only a cold, impenetrable facade. She understood, with a clarity that stole her breath, that his need for control, for her purity, was not about power. It was about finding one thing in the world that hadn't been corrupted, one thing that he could believe was real. Impelled by a force she didn't understand, a reckless, desperate need to connect, she closed the remaining distance between them. She reached out a trembling hand, not in anger or fear, but with a strange, quiet reverence, and laid her palm flat against his chest, over the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. She could feel its wild rhythm through the fine fabric of his shirt, a frantic, living proof of the turmoil he kept so perfectly hidden. The transgression was absolute. She was touching him, willingly, bridging the chasm of their cold transaction with a simple, human gesture. His breath hitched, and his eyes widened almost imperceptibly, his entire body going rigid beneath her hand. It was an act of surrender, but she wasn't sure whose surrender it was, hers or his. He moved so fast she didn't have time to react. His glass fell to the floor, shattering the silence as his hands came up to frame her face, his fingers tangling in her hair. His touch was not cruel, but desperate, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He lowered his head, and his mouth claimed hers. The kiss was not gentle or romantic. It was a raw, bruising collision of two solitudes, a desperate, searching act of profound hunger. It tasted of whiskey and grief, and a loneliness so deep it felt infinite. She did not resist. She opened to him, her hands clutching at his shoulders, kissing him back with all the pent-up longing, fear, and forbidden desire she had kept locked away her entire life. This was her first kiss. A kiss in a ruined ballroom, a sacrament of shared desperation. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the world irrevocably altered. The moonlight seemed brighter, the shadows deeper. In the ruins of her family's past, she had just surrendered the last untouched part of herself, and it felt less like a loss and more like a cataclysmic beginning. He stared down at her, his mask of cold control completely shattered. In his eyes she saw a maelstrom of emotions she could not name, raw vulnerability, fierce possession and a sliver of something that looked terrifyingly like fear. He had come here to acquire a pristine object, but in that kiss he had found a mirror to his own brokenness. He had intended to possess her, but instead he had been found out, his own desolate heart laid bare by her touch. He rested his forehead against hers, their breathing ragged in the charged silence. The cold, transactional world had dissolved, leaving only this raw, terrifying intimacy. "I'm not ready for this," she whispered, the words a final, honest confession of her deepest fear. It was not a protest, but a statement of truth. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice a rough, ragged whisper against her ear, a sound that was no longer a threat of ownership, but a desperate, shared prayer for salvation. "On the first night," he breathed, the words a promise that was both a terror and a hope, a vow that would shatter them both. "Everything will change." It was a confession that he too was on the edge of the same precipice, about to be completely and irrevocably undone. The dawn that followed was not a beginning, but an ending. As the first pale gray light seeped into the ballroom, it found the space empty, save for the glittering shards of a shattered whiskey glass. Ilara had fled, her feet carrying her back through the silent, sleeping halls to the sanctuary of her room. She did not feel triumphant or relieved. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by a fire she had willingly walked into. The taste of him, a phantom of whiskey and regret, lingered on her lips, a damning brand. She had crossed a line, not just with him, but within herself. The quiet, dutiful girl who had walked into that ballroom had not walked out. In her place was a stranger, a woman trembling not with fear, but with the terrifying, exhilarating aftershock of a world that had just been irrevocably broken open. Julian remained in the ruins long after she was gone. The cold morning air did little to cool the fire that raged beneath his skin. He touched his own lips, the sensation of her kiss an electric memory that short-circuited his every defense. For a decade he had operated on logic, on strategy, on the cold, hard calculus of power and control. That single, desperate act of connection had obliterated his entire system. She had not come to him with a negotiation or a plea. She had come with a truth that mirrored the desolation in his own soul, and it had undone him. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, a perfect metaphor for the pristine, orderly world he had so carefully constructed. He had come to the manor to possess an untouched object, but he had instead been touched, his own carefully guarded emptiness exposed. The morning of the wedding arrived under a sky the color of lead. A suffocating silence hung over the house, a stark contrast to the expected flurry of activity. When Ilara did not emerge from her room, a quiet panic began to ripple through the manor. Her father, his face ashen, knocked on her locked door, his voice a frantic, pleading whisper that soon escalated into a desperate, angry command. But inside, Ilara was deaf to him. She sat on the floor, her back against the door, the white wedding gown hanging opposite her like a beautiful, mocking shroud. She had not slept. She had spent the night replaying the kiss, feeling the ghost of his hands on her face, hearing the ragged promise of his words. She felt a profound, terrifying guilt, but beneath it, a new, unfamiliar strength was taking root. Julian, for his part, simply disappeared. There was no phone call, no curt message delivered by a stern-faced assistant. His absence was a statement more powerful than any words. It was a strategic retreat, a withdrawal to the cold, high fortress from which he commanded his world. For Ilara's father, this silence was the sound of utter ruin, the final, damning proof of his daughter's folly. He paced the halls like a caged animal, his despair a toxic cloud that filled every room. But for Ilara, Julian's silence was something else entirely. It was an acknowledgement. It was proof that she had become more than a clause in a contract. She had become a problem he could not solve, a variable that had broken his equation. His absence was not a rejection. It was the ultimate, terrifying validation of her power. The confrontation with her father was inevitable, a storm that had been gathering for years. He finally forced the lock on her door, his face a mask of fury and fear. He saw her sitting there, pale and silent, and the sight broke his last thread of control. The accusations poured out of him, a torrent of bitterness and blame. She was selfish, ungrateful. She had destroyed their last hope for salvation, condemning them all to disgrace and poverty for a moment of foolish, sentimental rebellion. His words were designed to wound, to shame her back into submission. But something had fundamentally shifted within her. She listened to his tirade, absorbing the blows, but they no longer pierced her. The woman he was screaming at was no longer there. She had died in the ballroom. Later, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Lily slipped into her room. Her younger sister, usually so fragile and lost in her own anxieties, looked at Alara with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of terror and awe. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. "They're saying you ruined everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alara finally looked up, her gaze clear and steady. "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps I just stopped letting them ruin me." In Lily's wide, questioning eyes, Alara saw not judgment, but the dawning of a new possibility. Her act of defiance, born of desperation, had sent a tremor through the foundations of their shared prison. For the first time, she felt she was not just a caretaker to her sister, but a pioneer, hacking a dangerous new path out of the dark. Miles away, in a sterile penthouse that overlooked the city like a god, Julian stood before a wall of glass, the sprawling metropolis a testament to his power, his control, his victory. Yet he felt none of it. He felt only the ghost of her touch, the echo of her voice in the empty room. He had spent his adult life building walls, insulating himself from the chaos of human emotion, from the kind of vulnerability that had once destroyed him. Laura had walked through those walls as if they were mist. She had not come to him with feminine wiles or calculated seduction, but with a raw, honest brokenness that called to his own. He had wanted a symbol, a pristine trophy to place on his shelf. Instead, he had found a living, breathing woman who threatened to make him feel again, and the terror of that possibility was a far greater threat than any business rival. The days that followed were a strange, suspended limbo. The wedding was officially, quote, postponed indefinitely, a polite euphemism for catastrophe. Alara retreated to her workshop, the one place she had always felt grounded, but the familiar rituals brought no comfort. Her hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy and foreign. The priceless books she was meant to be saving seemed like meaningless artifacts from a world that no longer concerned her. She would find her gaze drifting to the gifts he had given her, the rare pigments, the antique tools. They were no longer just thoughtful offerings. They were relics of a battle, reminders of a man who had seen her, truly seen her, even as he sought to own her. The central question of her life was no longer how to survive, but what she had survived for. One rain-swept afternoon, seeking a distraction, she took down the copy of Wuthering Heights he had held that first day. She ran her fingers over the worn cover, a strange intimacy in the gesture, knowing his hands had been there too. She opened it to a random page and read of a love that was not gentle or kind, but a destructive, elemental force, a thing of lightning and moorland storms. She had always believed love, if it were to ever find her, would be a quiet, sheltered thing, like the pressed flowers in an old book. But the kiss in the ballroom had not been quiet. It had been a storm. It was a terrifying realization. She was not a heroine destined for a peaceful garden. She was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind tearing at her hair, with a wild, untamable power awakening inside her. A week to the day after the world was supposed to have ended, a single letter arrived. It was not delivered by a courier or left with the rest of the mail. It was simply there, propped against the heavy oak of the front door, as if it had materialized from the morning mist. The envelope was made of thick, creamy paper, her name written across it in a sharp, decisive script she recognized with a jolt that went straight to her core. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside there was no letter, no explanation, no demand. There was only a single object, heavy and cold in her palm, an old, ornate iron key. It was a key that belonged to no door she knew in the manor. It was a puzzle, a challenge, a summons. The silence was over. Alara held the key in her palm, its cold, intricate weight, a stark, intangible reality after a week of living with ghosts. It was not a modern, sterile piece of metal, but an object with history, its wrought iron form speaking of forgotten locks and secret places. This was not a summons to a penthouse office. It was a continuation of the silent, intense conversation they had begun amongst the ruins of her own home. The key was a choice, presented without words. She could cast it aside, severing the terrifying connection forever, and attempt to piece her life back together from the wreckage. Or she could follow this single, cryptic thread, stepping into his world not as the purchased asset from the contract, but as an invited equal. The fear was a familiar ache deep in her bones, but it was now entwined with a fierce, defiant curiosity that was stronger. She knew this was not an invitation to a cage. It was an invitation to the heart of the labyrinth. She told no one. This pilgrimage was hers alone, a silent act of self-determination. The address, tucked into the thick, creamy envelope, was for a place she'd only heard of in local whispers, a remote coastal estate known as Thorn's Folly. The name itself was a premonition, a warning of obsession and ruin. She took her family's old, rattling car, the journey becoming a physical manifestation of her internal shift. The familiar, rolling green hills of her childhood gradually gave way to a wilder, more dramatic coastline, the air growing sharp with the tang of salt and wind-battered pine. With every mile that passed, she felt herself shedding the quiet, dutiful skin of Alara Vance. She was driving away from the life that had been prescribed for her and toward an unknown horizon she had to claim for herself. This was not an act of surrender. It was the first true act of her own will. The estate was a revelation, a Gothic revival masterpiece perched on a sheer cliff, its granite towers stark against a sky bruised with storm clouds. It was magnificent, melancholic, and utterly isolated, a perfect, brooding reflection of the man himself. This was his own crumbling manor, a monument to a past he could not escape. The heavy iron key slid into the lock of a sea-weathered oak door, turning with a deep, groaning sound that echoed through the silence. She stepped across the threshold, not into a sterile modern foyer, but into the breathtaking expanse of a private library. Books soared from floor to ceiling, a silent, waiting army of stories and histories. The air was thick, with the scent of old paper, leather, and the wild sea crashing below. And there, in the center of it all, standing before a towering window, was Julian, watching the storm. He turned as she closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place seeming to seal them in together. His face was stripped of its usual armor. The cold calculation was gone, the predatory stillness replaced by a profound weariness, and the same raw, unguarded vulnerability she had glimpsed in the ballroom. He looked at her as if she were an apparition he had desperately summoned, terrified she might vanish with the next breath. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its commanding baritone. "I thought I should," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. She held up the key between them. "You sent an invitation to a library, Julian, not to a boardroom, not to a bedroom. Why here?" The question was the heart of it all, a demand for the truth behind his cryptic summons. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led her towards a single, museum-quality display case in the center of the room. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was not a priceless manuscript, but a collection of broken things. A pocket watch with a shattered crystal face, a photograph of a smiling woman torn neatly in half, a tarnished silver medal. "This," he said, his voice a raw whisper, "is my life's work. The pieces I never knew how to fix. I spent a decade acquiring power, thinking I could bury them, replace them with things that couldn't be broken. But you taught me that you don't replace what's damaged. You restore it. You honor the flaws and make them part of its truth." He looked at her, his eyes a storm of unshed grief. "I don't know how. I'm not ready for this, Alara." He was echoing her own words, a final, devastating confession of his own fear. Alara looked from the shattered relics in the case to the broken man standing before her. The great Julian Thorn, the conqueror of worlds, was asking for help. Not with a contract, but with a confession of his own ruin. He was not offering her a gilded cage or a life of ease, but a partnership in the slow, painstaking work of restoration. Theirs would not be a love story written in sonnets, but one that would have to be mended, piece by painful piece, like the fragile pages of a forgotten book. She took a step forward, closing the final distance between them, and placed her hand not on him, but on the cold glass of the display case, her fingers resting over the fractured photograph. "Neither am I," she whispered. "But perhaps we can learn together." The future was an unwritten page, terrifying and vast, but for the first time she felt she held the pen. If their journey of healing and discovery has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what you believe their first step should be.